For months, it seemed as if the German elections were a little bit of a non-event from a market perspective. And then all of a sudden, weeks after, almost months after the event itself, it suddenly became interesting. Is this still, from a market's perspective, very interesting to you?
I think it is. I think that, you're right. The German election results, to some degree, were a surprise. Obviously, the migration crisis was something that was always going to work to Angela Merkel's disadvantage. But I think the uncertainty over the coalition talks is something that is now very firmly on the agenda for investors. We've just over the last sort of few days, last week or so, there's been this uncertainty. Today, as your report is suggesting, there's perhaps some movement here. As Matt was saying quite rightly, I think there's some uncertainties and complexities about how all this works out. And it may work out, it may not, but it's certainly something I think for the next couple of months is going to be a key thing for financial markets.
OK, so when we saw the coalition talks fall apart at the weekend, it certainly took the edge off the DAX. But then that quickly was unwound because many investors pointed out, well, hang on a second, the global growth story that is German, it is a global growth story, and that's intact. And we saw GDP numbers today looking pretty stellar. So does that outweigh, in the short term at least, these political tensions? Well,
I think there's two things. I think first, you're right to say that investors know that the global economic backdrop is quite firm. They know there's quite a good cyclical economic recovery taking place throughout the Eurozone. That seems to be across the board. Germany's leading the way. You mentioned the GDP numbers that were very decent indeed. So that's been supportive. And I think also the second thing, as we've seen elsewhere throughout the course of this year, investors have shrugged off a lot of political risk, a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. Markets have proved themselves to be quite resilient. So I think those two things together, the economic backdrop, the sentiment of investors, has actually turned out to be quite positive.